beasts, their feces is actually pretty dry, and if you were to, you can like pick it up and it like I don't know, it's not like wet and sticky and infectious. Like I think kids actually use it for like their own version of like snowball fights and things.
Oh.
Yeah, but I've seen like nature shows where they like. Well, no, but I've seen nature shows where they like pick it up and it's like perfectly dry and it's nothing to really worry about. So.
Oh, I don't remember the animal, but I know they've done that with other animals before.
Yeah, so it just depends on the animal.
I was gonna put my mask on and menace you, but I can't find the glasses that go with it.
Well, you menace us with just your voice, though, Dustin. It's okay.
Coming for you.
I wish I could menace people.
Or is it the heavy breathing that gives you away?
Well,
heavy breathing can do
I'm not putting the mic in the mask up against my face anymore. That did not work at all.
Dustin always gets belligerent when I start making noise. Just so you know that while we do this podcast, I don't usually just sit around. I like find a project and I do it so that I'm not. So I'm doing two things at once because it's like, to me, it's like sitting on the phone. Like I can't just sit there. I'm wasting time. So then Dustin gets all mad. Like, it sounds like someone's cutting. That's exactly what I'm doing. I'm making a project, cutting the board.
To be fair, when I complain like that, it's almost never you.
I think it was me last time.
I can see who's making the noise, and I'm not going to call anybody out, but I can see who's making the sound when it's happening, and it's not you, Katie.
Ever? Because can you hear the sounds I'm making now? I've been making noise.
Absolutely not. I can't hear anything coming from
I only heard someone one night when they were munching chips.
That was not me.
Oh,
no, I was cutting though. I was cutting last week. I think it was. I was cutting a big piece of like poster board. It was like, like really obnoxiously.
Well,
I was making a project for my kids' school.
It's like somebody is using their phone and then they put the phone in their pocket next to their keys and walked around. Like that's what it sounded like.
Oh my god.
It could have been scraping against their mic and on accident or something.
Well, I never heard that sound, so it had to have been me then.
Yeah, I
recall hearing that.
I use exaggerated examples to make a point, but that's somewhat what it sounded like.
In any case, getting back to this week's discussion. Hello, ladies and gentlemen.
All right, we saw a movie.
Welcome to Inside Movies Galore, where we have watched the 1996 film Tromeo and Juliet from Lloyd Kaufman himself. And Dane, why don't you tell me a little bit about the premise?
Who?
Of this
premise.
Yeah, the premise.
I'll say
Who did you say the name cut out?
Just say it, Dane.
You, Dane.
All right, fine. Well, yes, the premise of the film. It's actually my favorite Troma film. It's an adaptation of William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, but updated for modern day and in modern English. So you hear like bits and pieces of some Shakespearean verse in there every now and again, but mostly it's new dialogue, just following the story very loosely, and with a completely different ending and some completely different twists and things. But more or less, it's a fairly faithful adaptation, at least in terms of plotting. But yeah, different themes, different stipulations that kind of help to update it to modern day.
Okay. And when did you first see the film?
I saw it back in college, and that would have been...
Pregnant pause.
I want to say 2014. Was I
right? Yeah, I was going to say between 2012 and 2014, one of those two.
Nailed it.
it was my first Troma experience. I had seen a review that the Cinema Snob and Browse Held High that they did. They did a collaboration review of it. That's how I got to know Troma at all. And needless to say, I really loved it. I loved how it was really off the wall. It felt like Mel Brooks on acid, which is very much Lloyd's style is very much Mel Brooks on acid. And I really loved. I'm just a huge Shakespeare fan in general, and one of the great things about Shakespeare is that his work can always be interpreted and reinterpreted for every generation. And like there's been adaptations of his work in other languages outside of English. There's been like a Middle Eastern version of I think Macbeth, and it's like, so in other words, the reinterpretation of these classic works is nothing new, and this is just Lloyd doing his thing with it, and with the help of James Gunn on the script, who went on to do Guardians of the Galaxy and Slither and Super and the Belko Experiment, the Scooby Doo live action movies, as a screenwriter, and so yeah, it's
Scooby Doo.
yeah, he wrote those movies,
What the
and
fuck?
mhm. And they were kind of his big break actually as a screenwriter, um, like in terms of mainstream Hollywood anyway. But yeah, it's one of my favorites. I actually have it on Blu-ray, and I have it signed by Lloyd Kaufman and James Gunn, which is a big deal. I remember I was in line to meet him at Dragon Con. I waited in line for like 5 hours or something, and when I finally got up there, you could only have him sign one item because he signed for free. And so I was the only one who brought anything Tromeo and Juliet related, and he was smiling to see it.
Alrighty, and Katie, why don't you tell me a little bit about your first experience with Tromeo and Juliet?
Well, this time was a rewatch. I've seen it a couple times before. Like Dane, I also think it's probably my favorite Troma film. I haven't seen a ton of Troma movies yet. Like I'm still working my way through. There's so many of them. So, but so far along the way, it's my favorite. And I don't know. I'm so unprepared to talk about it because it's one of those movies where like it's really bad in the best possible way. So
Okay.
I don't know how to talk about that like in an intelligent way. Like I basically just fan out about it. Like it's just a fun movie, and I like the concept of sort of parroting the Shakespeare stuff. I was never big into Shakespeare. Like I remember we read Romeo and Juliet in high school, and I just could never really get into it. So I think that's why I appreciate Tromeo and Juliet so much, because it's exactly how I wanted it in high school. And actually didn't see this movie in high school. It would have been cool had I seen it in high school, but it was not until much later that I saw it. So, but yeah, that would I would have learned the story so much better if I could have watched it like that.
Well, what's funny that you say that is that the stuff that happens in the film, not at all far removed from stuff that happens in Romeo and Juliet, the play, or especially in other Shakespeare works like Titus Andronicus, which is a gore fest if you do it right. So it has its pretty clear literary theatrical roots.
Well, and actually, there was a version of Titus Andronicus that was not Troma, that was actually more of a gore fest too. Beyond, so it was a stage adaptation, but and I have it somewhere here, but it was. I mean, it all depends upon the interpretation. Red Raven, what was your take on the film as you watched it? Was this a first time watch for you?
This was my first time watching it, but I've seen other Troma movies.
Okay.
And I heard that this was the least expensive Troma movie ever made. And
Okay.
I've seen some of the Toxic Avengers, and then I've seen a movie called Poultrygeist.
Yeah,
It takes place like in a chicken restaurant.
I love
And
Poltergeist.
I think you could definitely tell that like some of the compared to some of the like Toxic Avengers and that Poultrygeist movie, it didn't seem there's some scenes in those other movies that were definitely more grotesque and definitely had a more comedic aspect towards them that was constantly, those movies seemed more harder to watch to me. They seemed a little more grotesque and way more over the top. This one to me was a tad bit more easier to watch for whatever reason. And I don't know if I just haven't seen Troma movies in a long time, and maybe I need to go back and rewatch some of them. But as far as I remember, they were really extremely hard to watch back then.
Okay.
It
And
seems like something you have to get a taste for.
did you enjoy?
Yeah.
It's an acquired taste.
Did you enjoy the film, as it were?
Yeah, overall, I thought the part I liked the best was how Lemmy did the narrating and how they had the Motorhead music in it. That was really cool. Because I know he did a bit in one of the Toxic Avenger movies, I think.
Okay.
Oops.
Dustin, was this a first-time watch or was it a rewatch?
So I found this movie on DVD on one of my first dozen or so trips looking for movies here in Milwaukee. And so I'd seen it a while ago. It had been sitting on my shelf for quite some time. I remember, I think I first saw it sometime in 2015, 2016. So quite a while ago. And I remember not really being too impressed by it, but that was kind of before I had really been able to appreciate stuff like this, and I found myself liking it a lot more the second time. Like I moved it out of the for sale pile onto the shelf. So I mean, it's such a bizarre concept. Like Shakespeare is really. I'm trying to see how I can not upset Dane too much. Shakespeare is really overdone / pretentious, as in like self-important, and so it was kind of nice to see. It's like, okay, we're doing a Shakespeare story, but we're gonna just go completely into left field crazy with it. And so I think I enjoy like the premise and motivation behind it almost more than the actual movie, which the movie was pretty good. All things considered.
Speaking of motivation, though, Lloyd himself has said that he made the film because it was out of how the baby boomer generation was treating, I guess, what would have been Gen X at the time, because the millennials weren't teenagers yet. So it's basically how his generation, as they were entering middle age, how they were treating the Gen Xers, and how society was telling them, everything is cool, be cool, and the president is playing saxophone, and all that stuff. And then meanwhile, the kids are experimenting with piercings and autoerotic asphyxiation. Yes, that's a tongue twister for me. But just in other words, dangerous behavior as a way to kind of escape from all that. And in a way, it's sort of a callback to the themes of Romeo and Juliet about generational struggles and that kind of stuff. So that was kind of his way of doing it. And I think Lloyd's kind of a romantic at heart. I can kind of get the sense of that. And
he has a lot of he seems to incorporate a lot of fairly advanced commentary into his work.
Absolutely.
And the way it's shot is like you can see one of his works and completely miss it, or it can just hit you right in the face depending on what your mood is at the time you're seeing it.
That, and also I think he's able to hit a lot of different kinds of audiences. Because like he's got kind of the broader slapstickier moments, and then he's got
I was getting a punk kind of feel from
absolutely.
from the band that was in the very beginning with the was it the Capulets or was it the Qs? I think it was the Qs bar or whatnot.
The
I
guy
don't
with the
think
weird hair.
I don't
I-
think any of them owned the club, and I don't
Okay.
think they
It
were in
was
the
just a
band
bar
either.
that they all went and had sex at. Okay.
It was that weird like goth club thing.
Yeah.
I don't
That
know
was
my.
so 90s,
I don't
you
know my
guys.
terminology.
It was kind of like death metal.
That movie is so 90s.
It's very 90s. Well, and what's funny is that it
Oh
came
my
out in
God,
19 well, it came out in 1996, which is the same year as Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet, which was also extremely
Oh, yeah.
90s.
Yep.
So it's just kind of funny to think about that this is sort of like the Grindhouse's response to it, except that the script had been in development for many, many years.
And I'm so disappointed that I didn't see it back then. Like, oh,
Yeah.
I would have really appreciated it. I would have. I'm sad.
What did everyone think of Will Keenan as Tromeo?
He
thought it
was really
fine.
good. Yeah, I thought he was good. I think he's one of the stronger trauma actors because he does an even better job in Terror Firmer just because he gets to play a different kind of character, but as kind of like the the hero role that's meant to be played straight. He can do that really well. I did like him as his character in Terror Firmer more, just because it gave him more to do, but without saying too much. But
Well, and ultimately, Will Keenan played in another science fiction musical that I really like called "The Ghastly Love of Johnny X," which later down the road, it actually almost didn't happen until someone ended up giving money anonymously to the director who did it, and it turned out rather well. He played this character who was an alien who was part of a group of 1950s leather jacket, gang, and they sang a few songs, and then there was some kind of a Frankenstein monster that ended up being in there as well. So,
sounds like a typical Saturday night for me.
And he also was a director of a few things too, which I think I was starting to watch a film that I picked up. I think it was a feature. It was called Maximum Sex Operation or Operation Sex something. And
Sounds like fun.
yeah, he kind of has like sort of Charlie Chaplin-ness about him in the film, I believe. Well, evidently, it was some secret operation to get like all these women in the same room at the same time for a marriage of some sort, and I guess it was kind of off the wall.
Speaking of Charlie Chaplin, actually, and getting back to the film, the well, kind of, but Lloyd is very Charlie Chaplin inspired, as am I. And one of the things, like, well, with the Toxic Avenger, I know that the romance between him and the blind girl Sarah was inspired by City Lights. Charlie Chaplin's masterpiece and my favorite film of all time, City Lights. So, and you can see kind of the Lloyd's inner romanticism coming out in that film and in Tromeo and Juliet. You see kind of like just the return to like a simpler age of just allowing the sweetness of their romance to shine, of the main characters to shine, like in Toxic Avenger, in Tromeo and Juliet. And then now with Return to Nukem High, you see the same kind of sweetness and chemistry in the relationship come out in a way that is very clearly Chaplin inspired.
I think that's probably my favorite part about Tromeo and Juliet and about the Toxic Avenger. Like, I actually
is the romance.
because I can relate to a romance surrounded by ridiculousness and like all of the things that make Troma films so great and over the top, and that sense of humor. I totally subscribe to that, and I totally relate to a love story in the midst of all that because
Well,
I'm
and
in love with a
actually,
really crazy,
well,
ridiculous
actually,
person.
Lloyd himself has said that part of what he thinks that the success of Toxic Avenger in particular, and I would assume he'd probably say the same about Tromeo and Juliet, is the fact that they were able to get couples to enjoy it and not just
Yeah.
boys or anything like that,
I have
which
a question.
is a very wise thing to do, I think.
I have
Yeah.
a question
Yes, I
from our,
agree.
Oh.
from our viewers on YouTube for a moment. Would we think that most of the Troma movies suck or are just funny?
It kind of depends on how you're feeling at the time. Like the first time I saw the first time I saw this, I was like, "What the hell is this?" And then I went into it again, like in a different mood, like I was today. And I was like, this is pretty awesome. So I think it depends on your state of mind and what you're expecting from a movie. I would say the Troma movies are probably fine. Like I haven't seen anywhere near as many of them as a lot of you guys. I think I've seen maybe 10 tops, and that's probably pushing it.
That's probably all
Overall,
I've seen too, Dustin.
I would say Troma's good overall. Like I know what they put into their films, at least in terms of like effort, and so I'd say their films are generally good. Uh, the only real downside the only things that bug me are like in some of the trailers for some of their movies, the effects look kind of gross, which turns me off for some reason.
Well, that's the
Um,
point. They're supposed to look gross. If they look gross, that's success.
it's a little too gross.
I would say about
No.
half and half. I would say about half and half because some of
Yeah.
the Troma movies are just plain shit. But
Well, it depends on who's directing them, because I've really liked the ones that Lloyd's done. I mean, but Troma obviously does not automatically equal a Lloyd Kaufman film because they distribute, a whole lot of stuff.
and I
well,
tend to agree with
Lloyd
you.
is the best they've got, like by a large margin, right?
Well,
Not necessarily. I mean, like Jenna Fisher, her film that the only film that she's ever directed was Lolly Love, and that was starring herself prior to The Office, like the 1 year before The Office came out.
and
And
let's
James
I've never
Gunn. It's a
I've never
great
seen
film.
The Office.
let's remember that.
And
The Office.
Trey Parker and Matt Stone's Cannibal the Musical was through Troma.
Yep, and
Yeah, it is.
that's how they got their start before
They're
they
not
were
like
in South Park.
they're not like the Troma regulars though. Although I love Cannibal. Like
Uh,
Cannibal is great.
Well, they've actually had cameos in. They were in.
They've shown up here and there.
Well, they were in Terror Firmer, and then Trey Parker was in Tales from the Crapper.
Oh.
Yep.
See, more stuff I don't know.
And then also remember Bill Rebane had some
Rana.
films picked up, Rana and the Capture of Bigfoot, which were distributed by Troma. So, which Dustin and I somewhat had an interview with Bill Rebane not too far recently.
What do you mean somewhat? We talked to him for like 3 hours.
That's somewhat.
It was a great time, sure, but I want props. Give me frog props.
Did anyone notice the sound quality was pretty poor on the movie too?
Oh, I
had to turn it up pretty loud to understand what some of them were saying.
Were you watching a DVD or a Blu-ray or what?
It was just on YouTube.
Oh, on
That's
Troma.
probably why.
That's why, because I didn't have that problem when I watched it on DVD the first time, and then now I have the Blu-ray and it's good. I do notice that Troma movies, like their YouTube channel, because they put a lot of their movies on there for free. I do notice that problem that you do have to turn it up somewhat. I don't know why that is, but yeah, I know that on the Blu-ray or whatever, I think it's good quality. One thing that you will notice though, as far as sound quality, you'll notice that like when not Mercutio, sorry, when not S. I'm sorry.
Friend.
That one dude.
My characters are getting mixed up. It's Juliet's cousin when he gets his arm ripped off and then he gets beheaded and all that stuff. You'll notice that his audio levels were peaking pretty bad. And that's the same thing happened in Poultrygeist, but it's like, and that's just kind of what happens when the onset audio peaks. But in their case, they're able to use it comedically, but generally speaking, you don't ever want to have that happen.
Yeah.
Did anyone? What did anyone think of the father? The father Capulet and his.
That's pretty fucked up.
Creeper.
Yeah.
It was very. I want to say
Shakespearean?
I want to say implied, but more so overtly shown, like somewhere in between that he was like sexually abusive. Like, that I don't know. There was some really dark stuff there, and it's like,
At
what's
first,
this
he kind of reminded me of
fucking box? What's this? Jeez.
Yeah, that glass
kind of
box was weird.
Well, that's why I really gotta give it up to Lloyd for being able to talk about serious subjects in a way that isn't like a complete turnoff or doesn't come off like too self-indulgent or too whatever, too
Distasteful.
distasteful, but also it doesn't detract from the seriousness of the issues.
Gratuitous, indulgent.
Yeah, something like that. And then I give major credit also for Jane Jensen, who I thought did an incredible job as Juliet. I thought she easily stole the show.
Well, and the fact that Tromeo and Juliet could not keep their hands off each other as soon as they got together.
Young love and all that.
Yeah,
Hey, I saw what? Oh. I saw Psycho Cop 2 the other day, like the uncut version, so the nudity in this did not faze me at all after that.
But
nudity should never faze you.
Well, that and even then in this movie is all fairly tame, and it was all I don't know.
Boobies.
Yeah, it was all actually pretty artistically done, which I think that's another thing I liked about it was.
Reminds me, what did everyone think of the penis monster?
Oh, that thing's been used in so many Troma movies, so it's not anything new by this point.
It's just like they have it around, and it's like, hey, let's just shoehorn this.
It's the same thing with the Sergeant Kabuki Man car crash or the way it flips in the air and it explodes. That ever since Sergeant Kabuki Man, that footage has been used in every Lloyd Kaufman film since then, because he's like, he said explicitly, he was like, I paid a lot for that shot, I'm going to use it.
For some reason,
there were they had the Toxic Avenger and Kabuki Man at that party too.
Oh yeah, well, that was the great thing, is that they were able to and you notice Troma posters on the walls, and I mean that's Lloyd is the master.
Shameless self-promotion.
Absolutely.
How about the Shakespeare pornos that Will Keenan was putting into his computer.
What about them? Well, there are plenty of real ones that are, I'm sure, similar to that. So those were like interactive CD-ROMs, but
I love that. Like, just tell me you love me and you want to marry me. Yes.
Oh my god, I forgot about that.
Yeah, but there are real
my
ones.
Favorite part.
Barbarian Dark Ages.
Oh, that reminds me, actually, one of the things I have to say, the music in the film was especially good. Like they got some good bands to like contribute. I think they just wanted the music in the film, and so they just gave it to them, and like that's how they were able to get Motorhead, as well as having Lemmy be the narrator. But the soundtrack was really good, and they actually sold the soundtrack separately, which most Troma films obviously don't have that luxury. But yeah, they were able to do that, and I was like, well, it makes sense because it's a great soundtrack.
So, yeah, that theme song though was so painfully 90s. Oh, I actually don't even like it. Yeah, I'm just saying though, like some of the music from the 90s, not so great.
Like
that
what?
song. No, like Goo Goo Dolls and that type of shit. That's not good. That's kind of what that reminds me of. Like that, and a cross between like Goo Goo Dolls and
Well, that and
I don't know, some like female-fronted grunge band from the 90s.
I hate
What
grunge.
does everyone think of the lack of Toby Hooper's inclusion in the Memoriam Sunday night?
I didn't watch the ceremony, but I heard about
Watch that
that, and
crap.
people were upset about that, and I was like, yeah, that's kind of messed up. Why didn't they honor him in that?
Yeah, I didn't watch the Oscars
Because
this year, which I
The
hate to
Oscars are
say.
bullshit. Boycott
At least,
that crap already.
at least
I
the at least movies
I
that
didn't
deserved
watch
it
them.
actually won this time. Like Get Out won Best Screenplay, which it deserved at least something, which I would probably give it for screenplay. And then The Shape of Water won 3 of them. It got Best Picture, Best Director, and something about sound.
Production
Does
design and score. It's like
anybody does anybody believe that anyone on set was sexually abused in this film at any point in time? Because
what Tromeo and Juliet?
yeah, just out of curiosity.
Well, that came out of left field. I would say
Yeah, I was
no.
gonna say. I would say no too. I was gonna say I was like that.
Well, but statistically, what are the chances that somebody would, just in general, like didn't feel like, who knows? That was 20 years ago.
Well, here's
It's very
the thing.
possible.
One thing I'll say. So with trauma films, Lloyd actually makes this very very explicit. So he in Make Your Own Damn Movie, he will say that if your film has nudity in it or sex scenes or whatever, tell them right away. And with your auditions or whatever, make sure that there are multiple people in the room, women, and make sure that and women present, and make sure that if that they like to get their anything involving nudity or whatever, they like to get it done right away, so that way if someone gets cold feet or whatever, then they can then they have a way to they're able to recast without having to reshoot a whole lot of things. But the point is just make it as crystal clear as humanly possible for that reason.
Well, I have to say that with my limited exposure working with trauma, I have never felt uncomfortable or, I mean, we had a little fun with it. We had a little fun with some pictures and some things like that. But it was never anything where I felt like it was being imposed on me. I thought everybody was very professional, although a lot of fun, but still very respectful.
Yeah, well, I know for a fact, just having read Lloyd's book and knowing him as a person, that I mean they make it about as crystal clear as possible that you don't want to fall into a Harvey Weinstein situation. And for my own sake, I was made aware of actual, sexual abuse going on with something that I was involved in. And then I promptly resigned from it, had my name taken off the credits, and warned other people to do the same. And I told Lloyd about it, and he said, you did the right thing. So, that kind of hits the nail on the head right there.
Okay.
So, I'm not going to say that I won't have Lloyd sign my boobs again.
That's consensual. That's the difference.
Well, the only reason why I threw that left field sexual abuse is because there are certain films that have been talked about where things have happened on set. You know what I mean?
Well, one of the ones that unfortunately does fall into that category, which absolutely breaks my heart because I love the film still, is Last Tango in Paris, where the infamous scene with the butter was not told to the actress, and they wanted to surprise her and all that, and no actual like penetration occurred, but she felt really violated, and it was not really in good taste to do it without her explicit consent and all that stuff. And it really hurts to hear that, because no one should have to go through that, number one. And number two, it is one of my favorite films of all time, and it's just like, ugh, now I have to live with this now. you know, for
Well,
this having happened on the set, you know.
well, there is kind of something. So my experience with that, I guess, sort of stems from what happened with Harvey Weinstein. Like, there were more than a few people who were like, we should, boycott all all Weinstein Company movies. And I was kind of like, well, okay. And then I started to look into it, and I was like, wait, that's like a third of all movies. Like, no, we can't do that.
Uh-huh.
That's impractical.
No. Just like what happened in the Clown House film, and
Yeah, Victor Salva.
Oh yeah, that's another one too. Like, it's sort of a complex story that I won't go into, but like, summarized, I didn't like Jeepers Creepers 1. I loved Jeepers Creepers 2 and felt like that ending was perfect. Then I found out about Victor Salva, and I was like, well, at least he's been being punished for it. And then it's like Jeepers Creepers 3 is coming out.
Yeah, he served his time. And I really liked Clown House. Unfortunately, yeah, that was when those incidents occurred.
That's why it doesn't have like a reissue. That's why it's out of print, because they won't re-release it, and that's why it's really expensive too. Which I have kind of a mercenarial interest in finding copies of it. So
that's a good way to put it.
Did anyone hear about James Franco too, or no?
What happened with James Franco?
Yeah.
Also,
apparently he got caught with sexual harassment.
Yeah, the details of that thus far have been very vague. So I'd like to know more about it. And
like actual harassment or Al Franken harassment?
Well, his was.
I don't know. It's up in the air, I guess.
His was actual harassment in its own fashion. You know, it takes many forms. Yeah.
Well,
I haven't been keeping up, but the fact that you use the term like Al Franken harassment tells me that there's clearly a spectrum, or you see that there's a spectrum for sexual harassment. So
there are different types of it.
When I found out about it, it was like I looked up, what did he do? And among the stories that I heard was, I asked for a photo with him, and he put his arm around my waist. Full stop.
Well,
like. No, really?
James Franco or Al Franken?
Al Franken.
Oh, well, no, he did a lot worse than that.
And not to mention about the Bill Cosby.
Bill Cosby actually hurt people. I mean,
sexual harassment is its own form of hurt, but you mean he actually raped people?
Bill Cosby is sexual assault. There is a difference. There were people who were like, oh, Al Franken is as bad as Roy Moore. And it's like, look what we know Roy Moore did. Look at what we know Al Franken did. There's a difference. One is clearly worse.
I like how your voice got really high there.
So, ultimately, everyone enjoyed the film, correct?
Yeah, it was pretty good. We went off topic there, but...
Did anyone have anything else to add to...
I like the scene where the girl was pregnant and then there was popcorn and rats coming out of her.
Oh, yeah.
That was the most bizarre nightmare. There were a lot of things that I actually really enjoyed. Like the opening credit sequence where they introduce everybody by name, and take forever with it, and then they lampoon that at the end, like mouse, and they cross out mouse, lizard, rar.
Well, you know why why they did that? It's because it's meant to replicate the dramatis personae that would be at the beginning of a Shakespeare play, to introduce you to the characters and their roles and things like that. So that's one of my favorite things about it too. Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet did that also in its own way. I like it whenever they can do that, replicate that part of the Shakespearean experience. That sounded weird, but
I just liked the subversion of there are some things that are done in any kind of media that just come off as really pretentious and frankly stupid to me, and so it was nice to see a send up of that thing that I didn't understand, why some people take something more seriously if they do so and so thing in a film.
Well, that's why they did it, is because it's a direct homage to Shakespeare himself, and in fact, a lot of what it was done. So like a little background. So Shakespeare and playwrights of his era were not well looked upon. Like their plays were performed in the same district of London as prostitutes, where the brothels were. They were seen as immoral and that kind of stuff. He was not in that high of esteem in his time, because nowadays one might say, "Oh, pretentious, self-important," which certainly not in his day. His was very popular, kind of lowbrow entertainment, so I think that part of what makes, I think it's just the universality of the conflicts is kind of what makes them last, as well as just how he's an excellent Shakespeare is an excellent has an excellent understanding of character in a way that transcends nationalities and time periods. And I think Lloyd Kaufman, Troma is not that well looked upon by the mainstream either, and yet it has had a great deal of impact upon those that like something different and off kilter. And it has a lot of I find that there can be a lot of deeper thematic significance that a lot of people don't necessarily pick up on, which is why Tromeo and Juliet's my personal favorite, because it's like, well, you can't really beat Shakespeare. And then when you have Lloyd doing that, it's like you got a whole lot of various levels of meaning that were already there on top of what Lloyd's going to do with it.
Yeah, actually, you gave me an idea for another point. I think it's more of the fan base, that the attitude that the Shakespeare fan base like brings into something, like how they're dismissive of like newer things, kind of tying into a bit of what we saw in the lead up to the Oscars, because there were a lot of that was sort of a story that a lot of the older reviewers just didn't want to see Get Out, and so they weren't going to vote for it, like because they were like, oh, that's a horror movie, it's not going to be good, or possibly.
I mean, the Oscars are definitely that way. When you say the Shakespeare fan base, I mean, that kind of encapsulates millions, if not billions, of people over, ever since the late 1500s, early 1600s to now. So I mean, that's a very, very broad spectrum of people all over the world. Because again, his works have been translated into just about every language I can think of. So I mean, I don't know.
I'm talking about like the intellectuals who see Rorschach ink blots everywhere and assign them like a deep philosophical meaning. It's like, no, it's just a spot. Just fuck.
Well, the thing that I have to say about Shakespeare is that if you've ever seen the full Romeo and Juliet play, you have to go see it at the Chicago Theater downtown, if you ever get a chance, which is right next to the Shed Aquarium, I believe. And,
yes.
Or whatnot, and
why would I just go to the aquarium? I love that place.
Because Shakespeare, if you've ever seen a full play of Shakespeare, he's actually kind of a perverted man.
Well, to be fair, the okay, so when you're talking about the age of Romeo and Juliet, I assume that's where you're going with it. Well, so like she's like 12, 13, he's 14. I mean, and keep in mind, people live in that era. Most people live to be about 40 if they were lucky, if not in their 30s. So,
anybody who knows history knows about the the age things. Like, it's not even a concern in the context of
that's not what I'm talking about. There's actually a part where Mercutio is actually his sex is actually figured out to be gay with all of the things that he is added to his dialogue. And
sure.
And,
okay.
But yeah, it's like it's implied, sure. You know, like thou art consortest with Romeo,
Well, and he
consort. You know,
even mentioned I believe he mentions his penis in several dialogue.
yeah, yeah. Here's my fiddlestick, and yeah. Well, that was also very common with people of the. Okay, so Shakespeare, Elizabethan gentlemen, well, they wore cod pieces regularly, and they also had their swords out all the time as a symbol of their royal or their gentlemanly status. You know, so if you didn't have your sword on you, then you weren't really a
Was he the
gentleman.
one that turned into a donkey?
No, you're thinking of A Midsummer Night's Dream.
Yeah, you're
Oh, okay.
Midsummer Night's
No,
Dream.
They
but
made the boy they made me read it in high school.
in
They all kind of worked.
the open, are you thinking of in the opening of Romeo and Juliet where they're actually peeing on the side of the building and they're talking about how their naked weapon is out, and you know, the all that stuff? I mean, there's a lot of sexual innuendo all throughout Shakespeare. It's not just Romeo and Juliet, but that's what made him a great writer. Is he was able to work in all kinds of subtle humor, and you know, it just, I don't know. I don't want to give a whole Shakespeare class, but it's like that's one of the many layers of meaning and sophistication you can find within a Shakespearean text.
Here's a question before we go on with any more Tromeo or Troma films in the future. This is a question to the women. Do you enjoy seeing male genitalia to female skin in a film?
Like on screen.
Like,
on
do I like full frontal nudity? Is that what you're asking me?
That's what I'm asking without
Male.
trying to entirely.
It's really, you don't really see it that often in movies usually.
You don't.
But
And I,
as-
unlike many women in my age group, am not afraid of a penis or a picture of one. Like I enjoy the look of the male genitalia, but yeah, I don't know that it always adds a ton. Like usually when I see it, it's always in a comedic way. Like even a couple movies ago, Street Trash, there is a couple shots where you do see frontal of a man. I think it's like when the people are fleeing out of the apartment building or whatever that's on fire. And it's like, it's usually stuff like that. It's never really done in a way like, well, I feel like female nudity is done in such a different way than male nudity is. And
it's not titillating for male nudity.
Right. And you can even take that into the porn industry as well. Like there's very little porn that's made, I think, to really, including males, to really appeal to the heterosexual women or the average heterosexual woman. Like plenty of, there's like girl on girl porn that's really big with everybody, but to actually see, porn that's geared towards heterosexual women, it almost doesn't exist. And I feel like it's the same thing. We live in a man's world. Let's be straight about it. So I mean, the female nudity is typically done better. So while I enjoy seeing male nudity and I'm all for it, I don't feel like I see it done really well. Not even half the time. Like I barely ever see it.
Okay.
Agreed. Actually, that sort of brings me to something that I'm surprised nobody's touched on yet. What did you think about the Capulet's cook, whose name I can't remember, and I just called her Celeste the entire time because of her piercing?
Her name is well, the name that they give her is Ness, but
Nah, yeah.
she the role in the play is she's the wet nurse. In the original play, that's the role that she fills. Her name is Ness. That is Debbie Rochon, who is a Troma regular and a regular of the B movie world. She's kind of a scream queen.
Yep. Which you'll see her name pop up from time to time in a lot of independent horror films. So down the road and anywhere else. So.
And her tattoos and her piercings were all fake, by the way.
Oh, totally. So fake.
So, did anyone else have anything else to add?
We haven't
Yeah.
talked about the incest.
That's
Oh
true.
yeah.
Well,
What is-
Isn't
by
that
the
quite
time-
Shakespearean though?
It is. Well, I mean, that's incest has been common in royal bloodlines for centuries.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
Not,
it's
not
weird.
to mention,
they want
well, not to
family.
mention that. I mean, that I have to give them credit also for having sufficiently foreshadowed their twist without giving
Giving
it
it away.
away. Yeah, which is that also is good screenwriting there.
In fact, it was
Mm-hmm.
fairly
Unlike
Red-
Old Boy, which basically tells you the moment the character is introduced.
Well, and I mean, the other thing is that I think trauma films are often people look at purely the craziness of it and they don't really see like script structure and they don't see thematic resonance or what Lloyd's going for or anything like that, and it's unfortunate, but I think that's just kind of the nature of the beast where people don't really want to see anything beyond what there is plenty going for underneath the surface. So I hear echoes.
What's happening?
People don't really want to see anything beyond.
We're going mad.
Underneath the surface.
That's David.
Get away from me, Sutter Kane. Your crazy books. I saw In the Mouth of Madness. I know what's happening. Reality's not what it used to be.
Was reality ever what it purported to be? Ever?
If you subscribe to certain bullshit philosophies, no. But anyway, with the when it gets to that point in the movie, like we've seen the incest thing, we've seen so much already that it's like, sure, fine, and it like, doesn't
Right.
affect you. And I would say arguably that's a better ending than the actual Romeo and Juliet. It's like, oh, tragedy, bruh. And it's like, I could kind of see this coming. Whereas it's like, oh,
and again,
what?
you're saying that as a 21st century person rather than as, someone in Shakespeare's time, which, okay, to be fair though, Shakespeare did not create the story of Romeo and Juliet. It was a story that everyone was already familiar with. It was a old, legend of sorts. And
Folk tale.
yeah, basically, and it was just his take on it, and then he got credited with it, but he didn't even create it.
I didn't know.
Speaking of Shakespeare a little bit, what do you think about the aspect that it was possibly not Shakespeare who wrote some of these plays, or what?
It's utter nonsense.
Tinfoil hat.
Yeah, it's utter nonsense. It's based on this pretty limited understanding of the fact that usually people say, oh, how could Shakespeare have done this because he wasn't formally educated and he wasn't this, he wasn't that. Oh, gee whiz. So you mean smart, gifted people can only come from royalty? They can only come from the upper classes or whatever? They can't just, be intelligent? And I mean, he had schooling, and it's nonsensical. I'm saying this after having taken a lot of Shakespeare classes for English, and I had this wonderfully stodgy British professor who pretty firmly took a stance against any kind of Shakespeare conspiracy theory nonsense, and I would concur with that because it's very disrespectful to the artist because it assumes that intelligence and talent can only come from certain upper class places, and that's just ludicrous. It's ludicrous today, considering how many people who've never went to college, how many of them find success, and it was ludicrous back in Shakespeare's time.
Well, I think that we covered everything.
The lizard was so cool.
As far as the film goes, did anyone else have anything else to add?
Well, let's see. So this was James Gunn's first script. He had, I think he was like 30 when the film finally came out.
Well,
And
he eventually went on to create the Guardians of the Galaxy, correct?
well, he didn't create him. He just did the film.
He wrote those scripts, right?
He did. He did
So I've got
He did the specials. He did the Scooby Doo scripts. He did.
I've got Sliver.
Yep. Slither. He wrote the Dawn of the Dead remake that Zack Snyder directed.
Oh, he wrote that?
Yep,
Oh,
he did.
sweet.
And he did Super with Rainn Wilson, and then finally
I picked both of those up, like the Shout Factory ones from Best Buy, like in the last couple of weeks, and so I might need to segue into some James Gunn stuff here.
Alrighty. Well, I think that's all for today. Why don't we start with you, Katie? Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do and where you're from?
Sure thing. I'm Katie Cadaver, and I am from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I'm a body positive horror artist and alternative model. And you can find me on Instagram at Third Eye Open. That's 3RDEYE0PEN. I'm also the makeup artist for horror punk band Ratbat Spider, and you can find them at ratbatspider.bandcamp.com. And I'm also a dead girl for Dead Girls Dark Coffin Classics horror TV show. And you can find the show on vimeo.com/DDCC. And finally, I'm a performer and producer for Grindhouse Tees Burlesque Productions. And you can find us at facebook.com/Grindhouse Tees. And we have our next show coming up on April 28th with Slaughter Party, Beaker, and Size 5s at Frank's Power Plant.
Cool.
Hooray.
Red Raven, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do and where you're from?
I'm Red Raven, and I'm from Lake Geneva, and I am a concert promoter in the Milwaukee area, and I'm a dead girl at Dead Girls Dark Coffin Classics.
Cool. And Dane, before I get into where you're from and what you do, you have some news to share with your newest short film. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about the project?
Yes. Well, actually, I actually have two bits of news. First of all, before we started this tonight, I actually was at the Carolina film community meeting where my latest short film, The Big Blind, which has Lloyd Kaufman in it. It actually got to be shown there, and the cast
Hooray.
got to take a little victory lap there. Everyone loved it, and it's going to start making the festival circuit now. That's The Big Blind is the film noir piece that I did, black and white, kind of an homage to the 30s, 40s, 50s. And yeah, Lloyd Kaufman is in it for a little bit.
How many years have you been working on it?
We filmed it in November 2016, and then now it's finally out. It took that long to do post-production, which I don't want to have that happen again if I can help it. But sometimes that's how it happens for independent things.
Well, why don't we tell the audience a little bit about what it's about?
Well, it's kind of a classical, and I don't want to hog everyone's time, but it's a classical kind of take on the tropes of the undercover cop infiltrating a mob boss's operations, and there's a femme fatale in there. It's very archetypical, but it's just kind of my take on it, and it's something that I'll be hitting the festival circuits with very soon.
Okay. Who's the main two actors in there, by the way, so that the audience can look out for them?
Yes. Well, the main three actors besides Lloyd, of course, is Kelly Melloran, Victoria U Bell, and then Kevin J. O'Connor.
Okay.
They are the main actors there. So that's the first film that is finally done. Second thing is I got the official okay from the producers to say this out loud, but the project I've been hinting at for weeks and weeks and weeks. Well,
Say it.
Yeah, all right, I can finally say it. He said it was okay. So I made a short film called The Slaughtering Ground, to be included as a segment for a upcoming horror anthology film called For We Are Many, and that'll
What?
come out. That'll come out sometime this year.
What was it called?
For We Are Many.
For We Are Many.
Yes, it's Hex Media. They're the people who did the Black Gloves, Lord of Tears, the Unkindness of Ravens, and I got the official okay from them to say that the segment that I did, it'll be showing up in the finished film.
Cool.
Go say it, kids.
Yep, definitely.
Fucking buy it. Buy his
Yeah.
shit.
When it's out, I'll definitely be advertising it like crazy. But I just wanted people to be aware of it because I got the official okay to finally
Can
talk
we,
about
like,
it.
is it gonna be like a physical release? Like, is this
Yes.
something we could buy and then have you sign?
Yes, it is. It'll be on their website, on Hex Media's website.
Cool.
Probably not anytime overly soon, but it's gonna happen.
Probably eventually down the road. Probably I would say winter.
Yeah,
That's okay.
That's
I
a
have-
safe assumption.
I have to throw an awful lot of money at Don't Hike Alone, or whatever it's called. It's getting a Kickstarter. It's getting some kind of physical release with a bunch of associated like trinkets, like figures and stuff. So I kind of have no choice because I know me. I know me too well.
Dustin, since you know yourself so well, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, you all know me. You all know what I do.
Not a clue.
That's a lie. Well, I'm Dustin. I live here in Milwaukee and I go to school. I collect horror everything. I have an Instagram where I show off a small fraction of my stuff. I actually posted a new picture today. DHR Hunter, all one word. And I'm also in name at least, editor for Inside Movies for Movies Galore.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm going to be forcing myself to put my first movie review on there fairly soon. So when the feeling hits me, I'm going to put the movie in and I'm going to write something. So yeah.
Well, yeah, I tend to kind of force myself to do so too. When it comes to a film that I'm not aware it's relatively hard to describe anyways. So
I keep having unpleasant surprises. It's like, okay, this thing's done. It's like, hey, you have a midterm in this class you haven't been paying attention to. What? So that's been my past 4 or 5 weeks. It's been awful.
Alrighty, and I am David Streggy. I run Movies Galore Milwaukee, as well as which is a blog site as well as a group. I also run Inside Movies Galore. So hopefully you've enjoyed this episode for this evening. I'm also a small-time producer. This last Sunday, I just recently put up the IMDb page for one of the things that I was producer behind, called Witch Town, which came from a director in Ohio by the name of Stephen Higgins, which, if you're interested, you can buy the film on his website. I think it's witchtown.com or witchtownthemovie.com or something like that. And I'm also a producer of Brad Tweed's Russell Massacre, which is eventually coming out this summer, hopefully, and definitely check that out once it comes out, and hopefully we'll have a fun time next week on whatever film that we do, which we will decide after the show. So
We always have a fun time.
in any case, folks, hopefully you've enjoyed listening to us. Definitely give us a like and a listen, and stay
Like, share, and subscribe.
And read lots of Shakespeare, please.
A quick note: I was actually part of a band at one point in time that was kind of a cough medicine band, and one of their CDs that they put out before I was part of it, and it was actually called Foot. But at one point in time, they had a CD called William Snakesbeard, which was kind of Shakespeare related. So, in any case, folks,
Good enough.
stay tuned for a lot more. We have an exciting year for you. In any case, Have a good evening. Everyone say good night.
Good night.
Night.
Good night.